right, guys, let's go ahead and jump into this first hand. So we are sitting on the button, and we look down at King, Queen of Hearts. The cutoff raises up to $25, and we go ahead and we just call. And we got off to a flop heads up, which comes 10 of spades, 5 of clubs, 9 of clubs. The cutoff checks, and I go ahead and I check. And the turn comes the jack of clubs. So we made a straight, but the front door flush comes in, and the cutoff leads out for $40. I think about this for a little bit, but I think I can still be in pretty good shape a good amount of the time. So I go ahead and I make the call. And we head off to a river, which comes the 10 of clubs. The cutoff now bets $140, and I kind of go into the tank a little bit. Prior to this session, I've had a few small short sessions where I've kind of been getting my head kicked in a little bit, just, getting things in ahead and then, being shown down a draw or something that always seems to get there. And so I'm a little more cautious during this session than maybe I should be. But the 10 of clubs is basically the worst river card I think I probably could have seen. Not only does it pair the board, but it puts 4 to a flush out there. So my straight, which was probably a good hand, on the flop and turn, has basically been turned into a bluff catcher. So after tanking for a little while, I go ahead and I fold. The cutoff just slides his cards over to the muck and scoops the pot and doesn't really say anything to me. A little bit later, I ask him what he had in that hand, and he claims that he had the flush. It was a low flush, apparently, is what he said. So seems like we made the right lay down there, and it's time for us to move on to the next hand. Moving on to this next hand, we're sitting in the middle position, and we look down at King 9 of diamonds. We're still pretty new to the table. The table hasn't been going for very, very long. So I go ahead and I limp, and the low jack raises it up to $25. The button and the under the gun 2 player both call. I go ahead and I call as well, and we head off to a flop, which comes 7-8 jack rainbow, 1 diamond. We check over to the low jack, and the low jack bets $40. The button folds, the under the gun 2 player calls, and I also fold at this point. I'm looking for a gut shot, and I've got a gut shot and maybe a backdoor diamond draw. And with the action so far that I've seen at this table, I'm not really sure that's going to be enough for me to kind of keep going. So I go ahead and I fold, and they head off to a turn, which comes the 4 of diamonds. And I'm going to keep going on this because this is a pretty good indicator of just what this session is about to turn into. For I found a really, really good table. The action at this table was just absolutely insane. So we head off to a turn, which is the 4 of diamonds, and the low jack bets $60, and the under the gun 2 player basically snap calls it. And they head off to a river, which comes the 5 of spades. The low jack then bets out for $140, and the under the gun 2 player goes into the tank for a little while before ultimately folding. The low jack flips over an 8, and the under the gun 2 player says, could you beat a jack? And then the low jack flips over a 5 to go with his 8. He did all that with 8-5 offsuit, including the pre-flop call. So it's definitely going to be kind of a wild one as we move on to the next hand here. All right, moving on to this next hand, we are under the gun +1, and we look down at pocket jacks. We go ahead and we raise it up to $10, and the under the gun 2 player calls. The middle position player 3 bets to $60, and then it goes, the hijack calls, the big blind calls, I call the 60, and the under the gun 2 player calls as well. And we head off to a flop, which comes 5 of hearts, 5 of diamonds, 7 of hearts. We check over to the middle position player, who was the original 3-better, and he leads out for $60. The hijack calls the $60, and then the big blind raises to $450. So I go into the tank here trying to figure out just how far behind I might be. We are 4 or 5 ways here at this point, and I'm thinking that there's definitely some flush draws out there. There's probably some overpairs, maybe. Maybe somebody got cute with pocket sevens, but I can't figure out, what's going on with the big blinds raise here. It seems it's insane. It's an insane amount, and I learn in this hand just where that comes from. So I tank fold. The Under the Gun 2 player jams all in over the top for $926. Middle position player folds, and the big blind snap calls, and they decide to go ahead and run it twice. The first board comes the Ace of Diamonds, Six of Spades, and the second board comes the Four of Clubs and the Jack of Spades. The Under the Gun 2 player flips over 8-5 suited of clubs, and the big blind just mucks his hand. And the Under the Gun 2 player takes down that pot. This was kind of my indicator that the person in the big blind was going to be a very active participant at this table with some very, very, very large bets. So I was hoping this was kind of a good indicator for me that this guy's going to blast off, and at some point I'm going to definitely try and have to catch something. But, you know, we made the right laydown this time. Somebody showed us a 5, and we move on to the next hand. All right, guys, moving on to the next hand. We are sitting in Under the Gun +2, and we look down at the Ace King of Hearts, and the straddle is on. Action gets around to the small blind, who raises to $15. The straddle calls, and I go ahead and I 3-bet to $75. Both the small blind and the straddle call, and we head off to a flop, which comes Ace, 5, King, 2 diamonds. The small blind bets $100, and the straddle calls. Now, the character in the straddle here is the big blind from the last hand that made the absurd $450 raise. So with a bet and a call here, and me sitting on top 2 pair on a board that's definitely got a flush draw, I definitely need to charge that draw. And I think this might be an opportunity for me to get some money out of the player in the small blind. So I go ahead and I jam all in for about $1,000 effective. The small blind goes into the tank here, and after about 30 seconds or so, he goes ahead and he folds. And now the straddle goes into the tank. Really what I'm hoping for is a call out of the straddle, since he's kind of proven to be a pretty loose, aggressive player. But unfortunately, he decides that this probably isn't the play. He shows me an ace and then mucks his cards. So we take down this pot and move on to the next hand. All right, guys, moving on to this next hand, we are sitting in the Under the Gun 1 position, and we look down at pocket 8s. The straddle is on, so I go ahead and I limp, anticipating a raise from a later position that I can go ahead and just flat call. And action gets over to the hijack, who also limps. The button limps, the small blind limps, and the straddle just checks their option. So we head off to a flop 5 ways of 10-4-8 rainbow. Action checks around, and we head off to a turn, which comes a jack. The small blind now leads out for $15. The straddle folds, and I go ahead and I raise it up to $30, hoping to target a jack high holding or maybe somebody who turned a straight draw. The hijack and the button both fold, and the small blind calls, and we head off to a river, which comes a queen. The small blind checks, and this is where things get kind of interesting for me, because once again, I have basically turned a hand that is supposed to be super, super strong into something that's kind of more middle of the road when there's 4 to a straight on the board. Fortunately, there's no 4-card flush out there, but still, you know, with an 8, 10, jack, queen, if somebody's got a 9, you know, I'm in pretty rough shape, and considering the action pre-flop, that's not entirely outside the realm of possibility, especially from the small blind. But you can't be scared of those situations, so I go ahead and I bet $100, basically expecting that if I get check raised, I'm going to want to throw open my mouth a little bit. But the small blind doesn't do that. The small blind just calls and flips over queen jack offsuit. So I flip over my pocket 8s, and we probably got max value out of that hand, and we move on to the next one. All right, guys, moving on to this next hand, we are sitting in middle position, and we look down at pocket 5s. There's a raise from Under the Gun to $15, and we go ahead and we call. And the low jack, the hijack, the button, and the small blind all call. So we head off 6 ways to a flop, which comes 7 of spades, 9 of hearts, king of diamonds. Action checks around, and we head off to a turn, which comes the 5 of clubs. The small blind now leads out for $25. I call, everyone else folds, and we head off to a river, which comes the 6 of clubs. The small blind now leads out for $75. And I go into the tank a little bit. This is, kind of been indicative of how some of my sessions have run lately. There's, 4 to a straight on a board where I've got a set, and it's pretty reasonable that the one card that makes the straight is something that my opponent could hold. But again, I can't be folding sets. I can't be that nitty these days. So I go ahead and I make the call. I flip over my pocket 5s and say, hey man, I've got a set. If you've got an 8, you're good. And the villain flips over queen 8 of clubs. And we lose this pot and move on to the next one. Moving on to this next hand, we are sitting in the small blind and we look down at pocket kings. The low jack, the hijack, the cutoff, and the button have all limped. And I go ahead and I raise it up to $30. And all of those players call the $30. So we head off to a flop 5 ways that comes king, 7, 5, 2 diamonds. I go ahead and I check to the low jack, who leads out for $100. The hijack, the cutoff, and the button all fold, and I go ahead and I decide that I want to charge any flush draws that are out there. So I go ahead and I raise it up to $225. Low jack goes into the tank, really thinking about it, but ultimately, as action heavy as the table has been, he's been one of the more conservative players. So he goes ahead and he lays it down, and we take down this pot. Moving on to this next hand, there's a new player that just entered the game. He sat down in the big blind, posted and folded, so this is only the second hand he's been dealt at the table. I'm sitting on the button, and I look down at ace-king offsuit. The cutoff has raised it up to $30, and I've been wanting to play hands with this guy for a while, so I go ahead and I flat call his raise to kind of disguise the strength of my hand. But the new player to the table, who's now sitting in the small blind, 3-bets to $90. The cutoff calls and I call, and we head off to a flop, which comes king 4-7 rainbow. The cutoff checks, and I go ahead and I bet $50. And this is where the hand starts to go off the rails a little bit. The small blind now raises $150. The cutoff folds, and I go ahead and I make the call, and we head off to a turn, which comes a 3. The small blind now jams all in for $493, and I go into the tank. I can't figure out exactly what is going on here. He 3-bets out of the small blind, which I make a note of in my head as a pretty strong action to take, especially as someone who is brand new to the table. This is only the second hand that they've played. And then check raises a flop that should be pretty good for me. So I'm not exactly sure what my opponent is doing here. As I'm sitting here in the tank, I'm kind of trying to narrow down what the options are that he's going to 3-bet and out of the small blind and then check raise the flop with. So what I narrow down to is if he's a wide player, maybe he's doing this with something like pocket 7s at the absolute bottom of his range. There's a chance he has ace-king also, which would probably be the best case scenario for me, or there's a slim chance he has pocket kings or pocket aces. That's basically what my brain kind of narrows it down to. And rightly or wrongly, my headspace up until this point over the last couple of sessions where I've just kind of been running face first into the brick wall of I have nuts and then somebody else makes better nuts on like a 3-outer or something, that is weighing heavily on my mind, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, I guess. So I'm sitting here in the tank, and I just cannot figure out what he is going to be jamming for value that's worse than what I have. I figure at best we are chopping this, and at worst I'm going to lose half my stack because I ran into aces again. And rightly or wrongly, you know, me not being in the right mental state definitely kind of affected my decision-making process. So I go ahead and I make the fold, and you know, you guys can flame me in the comments for that one for sure. It probably wasn't the right fold, but, you know, that was kind of the decision I made at the time. And my opponent flips over ace king of hearts for what would have been the best case scenario of us just chopping up this pot. So gotta, you know, pick myself up, dust myself off, and kind of shake the cobwebs out of my brain and move on to the next hand. All right, guys, moving on to the next hand. The next hand's kind of a quick one. We've got the straddle on to $6, and we look down at king 3 offsuit. The cutoff raises to $15. The button and the big blind both make the call, and I decide to defend my straddle here for $15. I've been kind of card dead, and the action's been flying around the table. And is this the right play or a smart move? No, absolutely not. I have no justification whatsoever for why I made this call. It was a bad idea. But nevertheless, I made the call, and we move off to a flop, which comes king, deuce, queen, rainbow. Action goes ahead and checks around. So when a turn comes to 6 of spades, I can feel pretty confident that I'm probably pretty good on this board. So I go ahead and I bet $15, and the cutoff, the button, and the big blind all call me. Okay, so maybe not. So we head off to a river, which comes to 5 of spades. Action once again checks around because I did my best to fire off at this pot, but somebody could have had a better king and had me beat. And I flip over my king and announce that I've got a king. Everybody else mucks their cards, and we take down this small pot as well. All right, guys, moving on to this next hand. We're sitting in the big blind, and we look down at pocket sixes. There's a raise from the cutoff to $10, and the small blind calls. I go ahead and I call, and the under the gun 1 and the under the gun 2 player both call. So we head off to a flop, which comes 6, 10, queen, rainbow. The small blind checks, and I go ahead and I bet $20. The cutoff calls, and everyone else folds. So we head off to a turn, which comes a king. I go ahead and size up, and I bet $50 this time, and the cutoff thinks about it for a bit and then calls. And we head off to a river, which comes an 8. I go ahead and I try to lead out for $200, and the cutoff pretty quickly folds on that one, so didn't get as much value as I could have. Probably needed to size down, and maybe if I'd bet something closer to like 100 or 105, I might have gotten a call out of a king or queen maybe, but it is what it is, and we take down this pot. All right, guys, moving on to this next hand. We are sitting in middle position, and we look down at pocket kings. We go ahead and raise it up to $25, and the low jack and the button both call, and we head off to a flop, which comes queen, 6, king, rainbow. I debate whether or not I want to check this or if I want to lead out. The table has been pretty action heavy, so I figure if I lead out, I could probably still get a call. So I go ahead and I lead out for $55, but both of my opponents fold, and we take down that pot. All right, guys, moving on to the last hand of the session. We are sitting on the button, and we look down at pocket sevens. The hijack and the cutoff both limp. I go ahead and I limp, knowing that the player in the big blind has been a pretty action player, and that works out in my favor because the big blind raises it up to $20. Action folds back around to me. I go ahead and I call, and we head off to a flop heads up that comes 7, king, king. The small blind now leads out for $15, and I go ahead and I raise it up to $50. The small blind calls pretty quickly, and we head off to a turn, which comes a 10. Okay, so king 10 just made a better boat than I did, but there are a lot of holdings that the small blind could have that he would raise pre-flop with, like king queen, king jack, king nine suited, you know, some of those. So I'm kind of hoping he's going to hold on to that. Small blind goes ahead and checks the turn, and I go ahead and I bet $105. Small blind thinks about it for a little bit and then goes ahead and calls. And we head off to a river that I'm just praying comes low. And my prayers are answered when the 4 of diamonds hits the river. The small blind checks again, and at this point, I definitely want to target a king or maybe an overpair to the cards on the board. So I go ahead and I bet $105 again. I'm okay if he calls me. I'm hoping that if he has a king, maybe he'll try to raise me to maybe an absurd amount. It's something I've seen this player do on a couple of different hands before. But the small blind goes ahead and snap calls me and flips over king jack suited. I flip over my pocket sevens and we take down this hand.
All right, guys, that's going to do it for this one. Got here around 1 o'clock. It's around 4 now, so I'm heading to pick my daughter up from daycare. So played for about 3 hours. In for 1750, out for 2410. I'll put the totals up there on the screen so you can see them. So pretty profitable session, considering that, you know, some of those hands, it got a little shaky there. So happy to be back in the saddle and look forward to seeing you guys in the next one. Peace.